last night at Dartmouth University, there was a debate between Spike Cohen and David Hogg. So, of course, Spike Cohen, we've had him on the show before. He was a former vice presidential candidate for the Libertarian Party. And then David Hogg, he rose to prominence after Parkland. He was a Parkland student, and then the shooting happened there. And he sort of went off on this trajectory of advocating for gun control. So they had a debate at Dartmouth. I wanted to play you just a little bit of their opening remarks.
I'll acknowledge that no law is perfect by any means, but there still is the need to have them in a society with order. And that applies to guns as well. No right is unlimited. There's a reason why you can't scream fire in a crowded theater in the first place. But that also means that we have to address, as I said, why somebody picks up a gun. In my case in Parkland, that looks like addressing the fact that the shooter at my high school had repeatedly, he was a 19-year-old, that had repeatedly threatened to shoot up my high school. He was reported to local law enforcement, he was reported to the FBI, and had had the police called on him over a dozen times before the shooting. Despite all of that, he was still able to legally obtain an AR-15.
I'm happy to be here in Hanover, New Hampshire, and as you may or may not know, we are right now in one of the places, Grafton County, New Hampshire, and New Hampshire as a state, where it is one of the easiest places, actually the easiest place in the country to get a firearm. It has the least firearms restrictions of any state in the union. It also happens to have the lowest homicide rate. And it's not alone. The other states that also have permitless carry and some of the loosest restrictions on firearms ownership are the neighboring states of Vermont and Maine. Those are the three lowest homicide rates in the country. Their rates are actually comparable to Europe.
Hard to argue with what Spike Cohen said there. When you look at some of the states that do have the lowest rates when it comes to homicides with firearms, et cetera, and there are areas where it's actually very easy to access a firearm, areas with policies that David Hogg specifically would probably not support and probably not like. But anyway, we asked our friend Spike Cohen to join us on the show today. He actually joined us from the car on the phone, hands-free though, hands-free of course, to talk about the debate and how it went. Spike Cohen, welcome back to Undivided.
Thanks for having me back, Brandi. It's always great to be on.
Yeah, did you feel like you won or lost?
I think I made the best points. I don't try to go into debates with the idea of winning as much as pulling people over to believe that I made the best points. I guess that's another way of saying winning, but I prefer to look at it as a kind of discussion where ideas were shared by both sides, and I made the best points, and I do believe I did that.
Is there room still for in America on this topic to change hearts and minds over to a different side?
I think there is, and it requires two things for those of us who support gun rights with no exceptions. The first thing we have to do is make it clear that we absolutely agree with even those who are on the furthest on the pro-gun control side, that things like school shootings, mass shootings, gun crimes, or any kind of crimes, any kind of violence, are unacceptable things that we need to try to reduce as much as possible. And then from there, explain, especially to the pro-gun control side, starting with the fact that gun control does not work, and we have over a century of data to prove it at this point. And then from there to talk about the solutions that we believe would actually solve this problem. We're not going to get everyone, but there are many people who think we don't care. All we care about are our gun rights. We don't care how many people die in the process. That isn't true, and the facts are actually on our side that gun control doesn't work.
Is it hard to debate? How do I put this? Is it hard to debate someone like David who came to his beliefs through such an emotional avenue? Like, is that kind of does it feel like a trump card for him sometimes?
I honestly don't think it is. Because I don't feel like David tried to use it as that much. I mean, he certainly, anytime he's going to talk about this, he's going to reference it, and understandably so. But I don't feel like, and maybe he was, but it didn't feel like to me he ever was saying, how dare you say what you just said? I survived a school shooting, anything like that. So it wasn't like that. But honestly, if he had, and it never really came to that, again, I make it clear that what he and his fellow students and the friends and loved ones that he lost in that shooting, what they went through, what their survivors and their families and loved ones went through, is completely unacceptable. And I talked about the fact that the 1990 Crime Control Act and the SROs, school resource officers, and no gun zones that came with it, thereby recreating the over-policing and disarming of peaceful people that we see in the inner city, led to the same kinds of conditions that we see in the inner city, which is namely far more shootings than before it was implemented.
So on, what happened in Parkland, and this was brought up as well, and he talks about the 19-year-old who carried out that shooting. And as you said, you agree, of course, everybody agrees we don't want shootings to be happening in schools. We don't want school children to be murdered in mass. I mean, to suggest otherwise is ludicrous. But he had mentioned, this 19-year-old, there had been a couple clear red flags that he was maybe thinking about doing something like this, wasn't mentally or emotionally stable. What would you do? What's the libertarian position on how you could have tried to prevent something like this 19-year-old getting a rifle and shooting up this school?
Yeah, the libertarian position is that Nicholas Kruse made multiple threats about shooting up his school. That in and of itself was enough reason for authorities to come in, question him, seize his firearms, and possibly arrest him for terroristic threats. They didn't. They failed. And the answer to that is to say we should give this agency, who utterly failed, more authority and less accountability and no due process that they have to go through, which is what red flag laws are. Instead, we should be saying whoever was involved in this needs to be fired. The procedures involved need to be looked at to make sure that they are actually doing their jobs and finding people that are making these types of threats and are presenting themselves as exigent threats so we can actually stop threats. Otherwise, what happens with red flag laws is they still don't catch the criminals. And now you have an easy way to swat someone you don't like. And that's what we've seen with red flag laws. Another thing that I actually didn't have an opportunity to point out in the debate, David talks a lot about high capacity magazines. Nicholas Kruse used nothing but 10-round magazines. And those are legal in California.
Yeah, we're actually dealing with, I don't know if you've been following it in our state. Our state has a quote unquote high capacity magazine ban that was put through in 2022. And they consider high capacity magazines anything over 10 rounds. And just on Monday evening, a judge in Washington state ruled it unconstitutional. Our attorney general got a stay. Is that a case that you're monitoring? And I guess, what do you think the broader implications of the outcome of that will be?
Well, yeah, the broader implications are, thanks to the Bruen decision, unless they can show something prior to the Second Amendment that was being implemented in the colonies or the post-revolution government, the colonial Congress government in any of the states that was anything like that, then it's DOA. It runs afoul to the Second Amendment, and clearly there was nothing like that. And so it does run afoul to the Second Amendment. The Bruen decision. The long-term effects of the Bruen decision are that essentially all gun control or all attempts to limit our access to firearms is blatantly unconstitutional. And the good news there is not only are our rights no longer going to be violated, but we know from long-term data there is a long-term trend of more and more guns in the hands of more and more people with fewer and fewer restrictions on their ability to access those guns and increases in the technology behind those guns. And the murder rate has been on a multi-decade trend of dropping. So it's good.
Yeah. Let me ask you really quick, just because you mentioned it earlier and I wasn't able to identify what your position is on it, is SROs. SROs, school resource officers, have been a topic of a great debate in Washington state. Some of the more progressive school districts in 2020 and George Floyd said, we don't want cops in our schools. Where do you stand on SROs?
Again, I think that the problem is they coupled SROs with disarming everyone else. Again, they introduced the conditions of the inner city, over-policing and peaceful law-abiding people not being allowed to defend themselves. And I don't think that the answer is to bring in cops into schools. The answer is to allow the faculty there, and possibly even the adult students, to be able to bring firearms into the schools. And that might sound insane. That was the status quo until the 60s in the vast majority of schools in this country, where adult students or 17, 18, 19-year-old students could routinely bring guns into schools. And a good number of schools had shooting ranges in them where they routinely taught students safe and effective firearms handling. There was, I guess, technically shooting happening all the time, but it was the kind of shooting you want. It was practice on how to effectively use it. And during that period of time, the number of incidents where a student or anyone intentionally killed students or anyone else in the school was essentially none. It didn't happen. The problem is not guns. The problem is that we are saying we're going to ignore criminality and instead blame it on the tool that's being used. We're going to disarm peaceful people. We're going to introduce hammers who see every problem as a nail. SROs have never stopped a single shooting, ever.
Is that true?
And they're not going to. Yep, that's true. They've never stopped a single shooting. They have run away from them, or they have reported them to police officers who then waited for the shooting to stop so they could go in and either abduct or shoot the killer after he finished stacking up his body count.
Well,
just
to stop you there, you certainly can't prove, because there wouldn't be any data, that school SROs don't prevent shootings by their mere presence.
Oh, there certainly could be a deterrent effect. A much bigger deterrent effect would be knowing that there are multiple people in there, everything from to the teachers, to faculty, to even possibly some of the custodial staff, some of the parents who might be there, and even some of the adult students who might be there, who will stop you from doing much more than you can do in the first half a second or so. And again, I know many people feel like that sounds insane. That was the status quo in the time in America, in relatively recent history, within the last 100 years, that there were literally virtually no school shootings. And the recent dynamic of this increase of school shootings started after 1990 with the introduction of no gun zones and the SROs that we were promised would protect us from shooters.
Let's end with this, because I think you and I probably both understand that I don't believe America will ever get back to the place where adult kids are bringing guns to school legally. Maybe you disagree, but I just don't foresee that happening. Is there anything that you think the two parties in control in Congress right now should be able to agree on when it comes to something to limit the amount of criminals using guns to hurt people?
I don't believe that there's anything. I think there are multiple things. We just saw the bipartisan 2022 bill that they said ostensibly is going to prevent criminals from agreeing to guns. I don't think there's anything that's bipartisan that's going to be effective. I think whatever they introduce will introduce hurdles to the peaceful ownership, lawful ownership of firearms. It will hopefully inevitably be found to run afoul of Bruin and the Second Amendment, and it will be put back in the toilet where it belonged. I think that the only real bipartisan agreements that happen in Washington are things that screw over the average American to the benefit of politicians and the cronies who put them in office.
All right, Spike Cohen. Hey, we appreciate your time.
Thank you, Brandi. Thanks for having me on.